This week, residents of Utah and the broader Utah diaspora will be celebrating Pioneer Day, the day that commemorates July 24th, 1847, when Brigham Young entered the Salt Lake Valley and said some variation of, "This is the place." Like most patriotic holidays and celebrations, the history is a bit more complicated. So in this video, I want to talk about the 3 lessons I wish everyone commemorating Pioneer would keep in mind when they think back to the founding of Utah. That Mormons, when they came out to the Utah region, were fleeing America, not celebrating America. That not all of the Mormon pioneers who came out to Utah Territory were free and therefore celebrating freedom is a bit complicated. And 3, that Mormon pioneer movement was part of the American colonization project that resulted in the loss of Indigenous land and autonomy. Let's dig into the history. I always chuckle when I see people celebrating Pioneer Day with American flags as almost a second 4th of July celebration during the month, when in reality the Mormons who moved out to the Great Basin region were fleeing the United States, not celebrating it. The death of their founding prophet Joseph Smith in 1844 and the forced removal out of Illinois led most Latter-day Saints to give up faith in the American experiment in total. The secretive theocratic council that was governing the church at the time, the Council of 50 that the Quorum of the 12 presided over, was pretty explicit in the records that were just made available about a decade ago, that they saw America as a failed experiment, a fallen state, that democracy could no longer protect the rights of marginalized groups like the Mormons, which is why when they were leaving Illinois, they set their sights beyond America's boundaries, and they were not shy about this fact. Parley P. Pratt, who was one of the foremost apostles and spokespeople during the church, even published an editorial declaring independence from America, repurposing the Declaration of Independence to have the Mormons declaring independence from America. So that's why they set their sights first on Texas, but when Texas was annexed by the United States in 1845, that took it out of their options. If they wanted to just remain within the United States, Texas would have been good. And they looked at California, and then eventually they settled on the Great Basin region. And one of the great things that came out of the Council of 50 records being made available is we were able to learn that they did set their sights on the Great Salt Lake region earlier than previous historians had assumed. Now, things shift while the Mormons are en route out west. The start of the US-Mexico War made it so that territory looked like it was going to be part of the expanding American empire, and that forced Mormons to pivot. Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and others who had previously been condemning the United States and saying goodbye to the American flag now recognized that they were going to have to work with America again. That's one of the reasons why they agreed to raise the Mormon Battalion, which was going to help in the US-Mexico War and bring in necessary resources and build some capital with the federal government. But one of my favorite anecdotes that captures their mixed allegiances is that when the Mormon Battalion marched into the US-Mexico War, representing the American Empire, they chose to fly as their flag the original American flag with 13 flags rather than the current flag that had 30-some odd stars, because their allegiance was to America's origins, not to its contemporary government. Then when they finally settle in the Utah region, Pioneer Day was celebrated very early on, but it was celebrated as Mormons establishing their own independent theocracy that they hoped America would leave alone. They were envisioning a Mormon empire. Here's an image of the boundaries that they wanted that was going to take up most of the Western territories. And they spoke about it in these imperial terms. They overturned American common law. They wanted to establish their own autonomous type of state outside of American control, which is why I find it so ironic now that Pioneer Day is seen as an extension of American patriotism, rather than how it was originally envisioned, a repudiation of it. Brigham Young was actually not the first Latter-day Saint to view the Great Salt Lake Valley. He was sick and ailing, so he was being pulled behind in a wagon, and a number of saints had already made it to the Great Salt Lake Basin and were already planting and building by the time Brigham Young crested the mountain and declared this as the place. Among those men who saw the Great Salt Lake before Brigham Young was Green Flake. Green Flake was an enslaved African American who had been baptized a couple of years before. He was born in North Carolina, moved with his enslaver James Madison Flake to Mississippi, and then it was there where James Madison Flake was converted, and his enslaved men, two of whom, including Green Flake, were also converted. It's impossible to know how much of a say Green Flake had in that conversion. Those enslaved baptisms often reflected more the interests and whims of the enslavers. Then, when the Flakes were in the middle of migration, James Madison Flake chose to send his enslaved man, Green Flake, ahead with the Pioneer Company, along with two other enslaved men, Hark Wales and Oscar Smith, who were enslaved by another Mormon convert, John Brown, who were assisting the Pioneer Company and could help prepare the land and crops and potentially a home for the enslavers when they arrived in Utah. This brings me to the second point that I wish people would remember about Pioneer Day, that freedom was not defined the same way by these Latter-day Saint colonizers that we might think today. And slavery was present from the very original days of Mormon colonization in the Utah region. Utah eventually becomes a slave territory, allowing both African slavery and indigenous slavery. And I've talked about these topics in other videos. Maybe I'll do a whole video in the future on how Mormons define slavery and try to differentiate it from Southern slavery, even though some of those core overlap remain. That should give pause to how many, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, including Utah, try to cast Pioneer Day as a story of liberty and freedom, because those who actually tilled the ground and helped the Pioneer Company flourish were not experiencing that same degree of liberty, and their contributions were soon forgotten. One of my favorite images from a Pioneer Day reunion 50 years later in 1897 is this one. And if you were to zoom into the very center of that image, you would see Jane Manning James, a Black Mormon convert who I've discussed in previous videos, who was among those pioneers, and she is the only Black face in that image. That shows how that history is, in many ways, whitewashed. Here's another image from 8 years later, 1905, where Jane Manning James is also seen among the Mormon pioneers. And this shows why we need to do more to reconstruct the lived realities that were far more diverse about the pioneers than our traditional myths typically allow. And the third point we need to keep in mind when considering Pioneer Day is that the Mormon colonization of the Mountain West region was part of the much broader story of Anglo-American colonization and native displacement and subversion, meaning that the Great Salt Lake region was not barren when the pioneers arrived. It was an active place for many different indigenous groups who have claimed it as ancestral homes for generations. That included the Ute down south, just south of the Great Salt Lake, and the Shoshone to the north, but also the Goshute, the Paiute, and the Navajo, who also had long claims among these Numic people in the Great Mountain West. Mormons envisioned themselves as kindler settlers, that they saw a divine destiny for Native Americans, and there was some truth to that. But that was often predicated on the idea that these Native Americans had to then conform to fit the boundaries of Lamanites, the descendants of Book of Mormon people, and if they did not follow that model and did not pledge allegiance to the paternalistic vision of Mormon colonization, there would be conflicts. And so there were violent clashes, massacres, where white Mormons killed lots of Native Americans, took lots of Indigenous land, and in the end supported the American project of displacing and segregating Native Americans on their own reservations. The pioneer myth, both in Utah, in Mormonism, and the American West in general, is papering over a violent conquest for these lands. And so Pioneer Day may seem as this opportunity for the Mormons to finally get their freedom, or at least some Mormons as I was discussing, but it meant the displacement and disinheritance of Indigenous nations who had long claimed that land to be home. I know it's a common thing for historians to play the role of the wet blanket and make us realize some of the unfortunate aspects of our history that complicate our patriotic and celebratory moments. But I think these lessons are important. So as you are considering and commemorating Utah's Pioneer Day, I hope you remember these three lessons: that it was not an expansion of American patriotism, but in many ways a repudiation of it; that freedom was not equally experienced even by those who were part of the pioneer company; and that Pioneer Day's expansion meant the loss and the tragic displacement of the region's original Indigenous people. Now, I'm glad to see that this is becoming better known. There's a new monument at This Is the Place Park in Utah memorializing the Black pioneers, and an LDS Church authority, Marlin Jensen, a few years ago specifically stated that we need to keep in mind the Indigenous perspective and recognize the loss that came with Anglo-American colonization through the Mormon settlement of Utah. I hope to see more of this. So I hope we can have a better consciousness. History has never been more relevant than the present because it gives meaning to our current day activities and views and places. And Pioneer Day is just one example.